I think we all need a collective deep breath after that. I think my immediate takeaway is, first of all, the story of Emmett is one that fills you with so much, and I mean you, everyone, including myself, with so much pain and grief and frustration. And I want to talk about, the Department of Justice and Carolyn Bryant, and we've got a long road ahead of us. But, the story of this sweet boy, that it makes you want to get in bed and just never get out, and not only did you overcome that, but you kept getting out of bed for 29 years and you never gave up on this project. And I want to hear about that, because I'm someone where it's, there's a certain number of doors get slammed in my face and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do some binge eating and I'm gonna get in bed and I'm just gonna, curse the world. And yet you just kept showing up. How did you do that?
Well, I would have to say the greatest inspiration to ever come into my life was the late Mrs. Mamie Till-Mobley. She's one of the most prolific people I will ever meet in my lifetime. I do not believe that human beings have the luxury of meeting great people like that time and time again. And she came into my life when I was in my early, mid-20s, I guess, around that time, where I was really trying to find myself and my place in society, and also trying to figure out how to make my own indelible mark in this world. Never thought I would be a filmmaker.
You wanted to be a lawyer.
I wanted to be a civil rights attorney because of the experiences that I had in the Deep South and growing up in Louisiana. And that's what I first saw until I begged my parents to let me sit out a couple of semesters and let me visit my best friend who had moved here to New York City. And I think I stated this earlier, moved to New York City to begin to work with his sister in her film production company. And that's how I was introduced to film.
So you sorry to interrupt, you started law and then you were like, I'm not sure this is the right path, and you convinced your...
I didn't say, I didn't know it to be, I didn't have to second guess of being an attorney. That is something that I wanted to do. That was something that I was on the path of doing. It's just that when I was introduced to filmmaking, it was supposed to be a couple of semesters of me sitting out. I didn't think I would be, something that I would like. I would tell it people often, especially when I give lectures in law schools, I didn't seek filmmaking like everyone else sought out filmmaking. Filmmaking fell into my lap. It actually found me. And when I made the decision to sit out for a semester or two for college, it was a big thing in my family's household because my mother was a professor at Southern University of Baton Rouge. My father was in the military for 23 years, first sergeant, so I grew up in a very disciplined family household. But my mother and father said, look, if this is something you want to do, sit out a semester. And I told them if it didn't work out, I would go back, continue undergrad, complete it, go to law school as planned. But it was at a company meeting I was asked if there was a story that I would want to tell, because we started off doing the music video productions and casting. And I felt like that was nothing that was giving back into my community. Having no type of effect, on what we live day to day. And I said if I would take on something, it was at a company meeting, I was asked if there was a story I would want to tell. Of course, the first thing that came to mind was Emmett Till, my kindred spirit that has been with me since I was 10 years old. But making that decision was a huge decision within itself, because you can easily say, hey, I want to make a film. many of us do that. But really getting out there trying to execute it, as you know, is a complicated journey at times. And so I knew when I made that decision and commitment that it could not happen without the late Mrs. Mamie Till-Mobley. So by this time, I knew nothing about her besides of what I read about her in the history books. And, like many of us who were starting off in film, we had side jobs. So filmmaking was the weekend thing, music videos and stuff like that. But during the week, I had to find how, to make some money. But my job was at Estee Lauder headquarters here in the city, which is, I know you guys want to laugh a little bit about that. But that was, a 9-to-5 corporate job. I worked in the legal department answering products that people had, used and had problems with. And I can remember sitting at my desk and I said, look, I cannot continue to do this. If I'm going to pursue the story of Emmett Till, I have to make the first attempt. By this time, of course, it's interesting because the times are interesting versus what is happening now versus back then. There was a lot of talk about appropriation and who could tell African-American stories. And there was also a generational battle between the elders in the civil rights community and, of course, young people who are coming in and trying to get their feet wet in activism. And so that was a big thing because they were often saying, what have this generation done to contribute to the movement that that you're a beneficiary of, And so you had those arguments. So it was very important that I would not move on this film of pursuing justice for Emmett without having his mother's blessing. So at Estee Lauder, I picked up the phone. Wasn't that easy, but I went online first. Unlike how we go online today, it was still dial-up happening. A lot of the corporate America didn't have, legitimate internet connections, right? And so I went online and I found a web page. We didn't have websites like that back then. It was only web pages, right? And I came across a web page with the Emmett Till Foundation, and at the bottom it had Mother Mobley, I call her, Emmett Till's mother's number at the bottom. And I called the webmaster to make sure if the number was real. And certainly it was. And I made the decision to call. Picked up the phone, dialed the number. As soon as she picked up, I quickly hung up in her face. And I hung up in her face because I didn't know what type of life she had been living. I didn't want to open up old wounds. There were all these things going through my mind because, remember, I'm in my early 20s doing this. And so I fussed at myself for hanging up in her face. And I said, you know what, if I'm going to make this happen, I've got to call her back. So I called her back. She picks up the phone, and I immediately apologized to her. And she could sense that I was very nervous. And she said to me, baby, just calm down and talk to me. So I began to tell her how I was introduced to Till and how Till has been a very big part of my life, that I wanted to reach out because I had this crazy idea of wanting to produce a feature film and a documentary on Till. And so she was shocked that someone so young would be interested in going down this road. And we ended up talking 2.5 hours for the first time on the phone. And that was in 95. We met 96, 2 weeks before Christmas, face to face. And I can recall when I was with my best friend, We flew into Chicago. Getting out of O'Hare Airport, we had a taxi driver to take us to Mrs. Mobley's home. And I can remember the taxi driver got so excited when he saw the address because he knew where Mother Mobley lived, and he was just excited about young people going to see her because she's iconic in Chicago.
She's iconic in many places.
In many places, but in particularly Chicago, people know her. And so we get to her home, and I knock on the door. I'm escorted through the home by a cousin. And I look from a distance, and I see Mr. Mobley, Emmett's stepfather, and of course, Mother Mobley sitting there with a big smile on her face. And the way she was here, the way she would describe it, because I've heard her describe our relationship and then meet for the first time. She said it was like a love affair of our meeting. And the reason being is because she herself I felt a little of the void of her losing Emmett. And she filled the void of me losing my grandmother at that time, because that's what I lost my grandmother before we actually met. And that relationship ended up lasting for 8.5 years until she took her last breath. But what she did was she inspired me to join in on her fight to make sure that justice is done in Emmett's case, as well as to make sure a hate crime bill is named in Emmett's name, as well as to finally get the story of Emmett Till on the big screen. So nothing that I've ever done has been outside of what she wanted. And of course, out of that 8.5 relationship, and my first failed attempt of producing a movie on Till, because all this started off with my passion wanting to tell the story of Till on big screen. I ended up writing a screenplay in early '95 that was optioned off by producers who worked with Showtime. And they sat on the project, and the option period was like 3 years. So there was no way I had any kind of control of that content. Thank God I didn't, because it would have been the worst movie to produce at the time. But out of that frustration and going into Mississippi, finding eyewitnesses who have never spoke publicly, knowing that I could possibly have evidence that would prove critical in the reopening of the case, I was encouraged by Mother Mobley to produce the documentary, to use that as a stepping stone in hopes of us getting justice done. And she always said, after that, you may have another opportunity to tell this story, so you'll tell that story then. So, what's wonderful about this is the fact that 1 year after her passing in 2004, our prayers, our dreams was answered when the United States Department of Justice reopened the murder case, the nearly 50-year-old murder case at that time, citing my research and documentary, The Untold Story of Emmett Louis Till. The greatest part of that was that my executive producers were my parents. They gave me the money I was supposed to go to law school with to produce Till. So if not for my parents believing in me and believing in the story, I probably wouldn't be sitting here before you today.
I want to talk about that Department of Justice reopening the case, because it didn't really yield the results that we hoped for at that time. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, maybe talk about the 14 people, I think is the number, and then Carol and Bryant still walking around.
Absolutely. So out of that research, I discovered there was up to 14 people involved with the kidnapping and murder of Emmett Louis Till. 5 of these people were black men who we believe who were forced to participate in the crime. So from 2004 all the way to 2007, I was closely involved with the Till investigation because of my overwhelming knowledge and evidence that I brought forward against the perpetrators who were there. By the time we reached the grand jury, where I should say the investigation was over and the findings was handed over by DOJ to the state because the federal government did not have jurisdiction at that time. We in fact used a federal law that was only used with the assassination of Dr. King and Kennedy to get the federal government involved. And their involvement was to simply help and assist in the investigation and hand over their findings to the local authorities, in particular the DA. And that's what happened. So by the time the evidence went to the DA, there was only 2 people we were looking at that time, and one was Henry Lee Loggins. If you have not seen The Untold Story of Emmett Louis Till, my documentary, I interviewed Henry Lee Loggins in the film, and of course, Carolyn Bryant Dunham, the white woman in the Till whistle at. Unfortunately, during those proceedings, a grand jury made a decision not to indict the remaining suspects in the case. So the case stood dormant for many years out of my frustration and, of course, family members being upset. But what ends up happening in 2017, a professor at Duke University, Dr. Tim Tyson, published a book, The Blood of Emmett Till, which boasted that he was able to get a confession from Carolyn Bryant stating that she fabricated her story in 1955. So when I hear this, I go back to family members, in particular Simeon Wright, the late Simeon Wright, who was our consultant producer on this film. And I talked to him and I'm like, what do we want to do here? And he looks at me and he says, Keith, we need to continue what Mamie wanted you to do and what I wanted you to do. So let's move forward. If we could get this case reactivated, let's make it happen. So I immediately retained an attorney for Mr. Wright and the family. And her name is Jaribu Hill, who's currently our attorney on this case. And we reached out to the DA and convinced him to reactivate the case itself. And so what ends up happening in the midst of this, Mr. Wright passes away from cancer, unfortunately. The case was reopened and reactivated, like I stated, and then the case stood dormant again because, one, personally, I had to get past the pain of losing someone else in my life who was intricate to the story and a good friend and mentor. And then secondly, it just really was frustrating to have so much traction early on with the earlier investigation of Till. And then after this, no one was really talking about it as much. And the DOJ was not, and they may, be upset, I'll say this, but I'm gonna be honest, it was a different administration, and they did not feel compelled to even push this case forward. So what we needed at that point was, of course, people power to get people to drum things up, to get the public behind the efforts, and to get people to understand that this case is still open and we're waiting for answers. And so the family came out in droves to begin to push DOJ to make a decision. And of course, they made a decision in 2021 that they were going to step away from the investigation because they did not have jurisdiction. And of course, there was no evidence that Dr. Tim Tyson actually brought forward to show that Carolyn Bryant Dunham actually lied. But the thing is this. I knew early on that Tyson did not have the information. And that's because I knew when he interviewed Carolyn Bryant, and we talked right afterwards. He never said anything of the sort. All he said to me was that Carolyn did not say much that could help with the case. And that was in 2008. So all of a sudden in 2017, he has this newfound evidence that he claimed he got from Carolyn Bryant that she fabricated a story. So that wasn't the big thing. When newspaper articles came out about the publication of this book, they specifically talked about the memoir, a memoir that Carolyn Bryant Dunham wrote that was not supposed to be seen until 2036, way after she was gone. That's what I was after. And so immediately when the case was reactivated, I was saying, we gotta get our hands on those memoirs. And they were able to do it. Now the disappointment was DOJ backed away from it because they never really had jurisdiction, and everything fell in the lap of the DA. And so that was a huge frustration for me, being that the most corruption that you would see dealing with civil rights cold cases from our past is not on the federal level, but on the state and local level. And so when DOJ made this announcement, they were backing away. We're dealing with a black DA of the county who's not in favor of seeing justice done in this case. And so they went out and said they did everything about the investigation, and there was nothing else to be found. And so out of the frustration of that, I began to review my past research on the investigation and realized, thanks to the family, because they were on me about it, Till family, that we didn't look too much into the kidnapping of 1955. I remember one of the first documents that I handed over to DOJ was a document from the FBI records, the original FBI records, that stated that there was a warrant out for Carolyn Bryant's arrest, which was never served because she could not be found. The family was on me about how likely if possible, that this warrant actually exists. And so what we ended up doing is leading a search in the courthouse. I was given the access to the courthouse, and the historic courthouse, the Greenwood Courthouse where Roy Bryant and J.W. Mao was held in 1955. It also was the location of the Sheriff's Department as well as the county jail. In the late 80s, the county jail and the Sheriff's Department relocated, but they left all the files there. So I go to the historic courthouse and began a search on my own at first and realized I was dealing with a monster. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of boxes everywhere, which means there were thousands and thousands of individual documents. And I was looking through boxes all day, and I said, it is totally impossible for me to continue this on my own. So we tried to actually bring in law students and historians to come in to assist, but the timing was wrong. We couldn't get everybody in time, so the family members of the Emmett Till Foundation, Emmett Till Legacy Foundation, said, look, Keith, we'll search with you. So we went down an anniversary of the 3 civil rights workers on June 21st. We started with our left off search, and that was in the circuit court clerk's office basement. And within an hour and a half of searching through these boxes of files, we were able to locate and find, of course, the 67-year-old outstanding warrant against Carolyn Bryant Dunham. There were 3 names that was on the documentation as well as the warrant. One was J.W. Malum, the second was Roy Bryant, and the third said Mrs. Roy Bryant. Everyone got excited about it. We knew it existed. Nobody had ever seen it. Since 67 years, nobody had set their eyes on these documents. What the family didn't realize that I was trying to process and I was afraid of was, one, I was hoping the affidavit was attached to it, which it was. So we had probable cause, and it came from Moses Wright. Emmett's great uncle actually went to the police department and shared his story of what happened that night and gave them, information and evidence of what he saw, and it was documented. So we had probable cause, which is why the warrant was issued. The last thing I had to look very closely for, and by this time, people are crying. Family members are crying. We're all in this basement. And I was so afraid to turn that last page because I was looking for the minutes book, minutes book for the case, which would have documented and recorded all that we needed to know from the judge on if the warrant is still active or not, or rescinded, because only a judge can rescind this warrant. And I flipped over the page, and it was very odd and rare that you would have basically this document attached to the warrant, and it was there and it didn't say anything, which meant this was an outstanding warrant, but it was still active. So what did I decide to do with the family? We go public with it. And it embarrassed the shit out of DOJ and, of course, the local authorities. Sometimes you got to do that. Even though I work with them from time to time, I had to do it to show them that they did not do everything that needed to be done with this case. I knew something existed in the courthouse. I just didn't know how long it was going to take for me to find it. So we find this, and almost immediately afterwards, because you probably recognize all the media attention at that time, I released the memoir to the media. And so we had not only this warrant, but we also have this, of course, memoir Carolyn Bryant had written that is not supposed to be released until 2036. Which shows even more of our probable cause. I mean, not probable cause, but our culpability. What is our culpability? I'm sorry, I'm long-winded. You have to bear with me for a second. Before Till was picked up that early morning at 2 a.m., that day, actually, there were 2 kids who was assaulted and kidnapped as well. Both occasions, Carolyn Bryant was present. The first occasion, this young boy was in the store. He had just come from Chicago. He's bragging to his mother about the things he saw. Roy Bryant overhears this and goes to this kid and roughs him up in front of his mother. And Carolyn Bryant walks out and said, "That's not the boy." The second kid is walking along the side of a highway. There's Carolyn Bryant, Roy Bryant in the cab of the truck. You have J.W. Mountain as well as in the cab of the truck. A black field hand by the name of Johnny B. Washington is in the bed of the truck, and they drive alongside the highway towards this kid. and they order Johnny B. Washington to grab the kid. And they grab the kid, tosses him on the bed of the truck, holds his head up to the cab of the truck. Carolyn Bryant turns around and says, that's not the right nigger, throw him back. So they throw him off a moving truck. So these are two men that I actually was able to locate at that time. Oh, I should say at that time, but later on, during my investigation, that we all felt would be enough to indict her and show her culpability. Because what we were looking at was culpable negligence, culpable manslaughter. And what this means is Carolyn Bryant had to understand the danger Emmett Till would be in and did nothing to stop it. And so these two incidents actually supports that. We all know that when she encounters Emmett, whether you want to go with her theory, which was the theory of Roy and J.W. Milam, she argued that she was never at the house that night. That was her argument. And that only came because the men, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, gave her the authorities an alibi because they didn't want her to be known to have been at the house. But they claimed they went along and they brought Emmett to Carolyn Bryant. And Carolyn said, that's not him. But Emmett Till is dead. And so the biggest problem with dealing with this case has always been the way people tell the story and gravitate to the murderer's account. William Bradley Huey, who did the Look magazine piece, he was a sympathizer to Roy and J.W. Milam. In fact, the $4,000 was not actually for the Look magazine publication. It was actually for a depiction agreement. You know, it's funny how this story is so entwined with film on both sides, whether it's the players of the Emmett Till case or those who are investigating or it's around it.
And just to put it in perspective, that $4,000 was $4,000 back then. So yes. I think now it'd be like $40,000. So just in perspective.
That was all for a depiction agreement. Yeah. And there were other people who participated who were interviewed, but unfortunately, William Bradley Huey didn't, get their release forms done in time, and so on. So this is an amazing story to be at this point and now see all these facts coming out, and about it. But where are we at this point currently, and then we can move on to other questions, so we get this out the way, is that when we located, of course, the warrant, all the critics were saying that the warrant was not valid. Even the authorities, not the FBI, but the local authorities were trying to say that it wasn't evidence. What ends up happening, the DA, after our finding of this, immediately convenes a grand jury for kidnapping and murder in Lafleur County and presents his evidence. We don't know what that is because it's a secret grand jury. 2 grand jurors who then come back and give us an unfavorable decision by passing a no true bill and claiming there's not enough evidence against Carolyn Bryant. Now, this just happened in August. And what we did was legally, because we knew that he was not in the favor of getting justice done in this case, what our attorneys did immediately before he made this decision was to file a writ of mandamus on the DA as well as the sheriff to force their hand in doing their jobs, to put them on alert to say, this is your job and you should do it. Now, what we found out after this decision from the DA by going straight to a grand jury, which we wanted to be done. We wanted it to be done. But he circumvented the whole process. First, he was supposed to execute this outstanding warrant. But he made the decision to go to a grand jury so he could hold his hat on their decision so that he wouldn't have to deal with the fact of having to hand over or to force someone to execute a 67-year-old warrant against an 80-something-year-old white woman. So the harsh reality, and I hate to be this harsh, but the reality is the only reason why Carolyn Bryant Dunham is not in jail today is because of the protection of white womanhood. That is what we're dealing with. Now, the case is not over because there's no statute of limitation to kidnapping and murder in the state of Mississippi. And there's some legal things that is happening right now. There's a review that's getting ready to, we'll be able to get the results of the review by a judge to see how we can proceed to go forward and go after Carolyn Bryant Dunham, who is one of the remaining, and I say who is one of the remaining because only she would know who is still with us, who are participants in the kidnapping and murder. But this is the opportunity that we have, and we have to make sure that she is held accountable for her actions. The frustrating thing for me is to work on this story, this case, for most of my life. And I actually watch Nazi war criminals at 101 years old being extradited, 97 years old being extradited, or 97 years old and 101 years old brought into the courts of Germany and held accountable for their actions and prosecuted. If we could do that with Nazi war criminals, we certainly could do that with civil rights war criminals in this country. I have no love for Carolyn Bryant Dunham. I'm sorry. She is not the innocent woman that people want to make her out to be. And in the reality that we live, the harsh reality, because I know people are waiting, maybe she could have a come to Jesus moment. No, I worked, if you know my work, I worked on hundreds of civil rights murder cases. That doesn't happen as much in the real world that you think. Some people just die evil. And that's what the reality is.
We got to get her before she dies.
Yeah, she's 88 years old. Until she reached 101 years old or 97, then I would be like, pins and needle. But I have faith that something is going to happen. Emmett was the catalyst that sparked the American Civil Rights Movement. And no one relishes death. And I'm not trying to compare this death, the death of Emmett Till, his lynching, to anyone else's lynching. But if we want to pride ourselves in this country to be a country of truth, and if we're really longing for racial reconciliation, that will never happen unless you have truth and the component of justice. And that's what we have to all be faced with, justice-seeking people. That's what we have to remember.
And I can't remember if we talked about this. I brought Keith to campus a couple of years ago. We did a screening of the Emmett Till documentary. And I think we talked about Rosa Parks and her connection to Emmett. Yes. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, when we talk about Emmett Till, it's very important that we put his story in its rightful context in history. I mean, over time, people have tried to do it, but we haven't truly done it like we're supposed to. Emmett, as I mentioned, was the catalyst of the American Civil Rights Movement. You probably hear people reference Emmett as being the sacrificial lamb of the Civil Rights Movement. It's because of Emmett's death that we see the likes of Rosa Parks, who I had the pleasure of meeting through Mother Mobley because they were good friends. And she said that Emmett Till was foremost in her mind the day she made her decision, her courageous decision, not to get up from that bus, her seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Martin Luther King, who was 26 years old at the time, took on the Montgomery bus boycott not just simply because of the actions of Sister Rosa Parks. It's because he was also hurt by the lynching of Emmett Till. He, in fact, felt the lynching of Emmett Till was an intimidation factor to keep black people away from the polls. 1955 was an election year. So again, why do we call Emmett the catalyst that sparked the American Civil Rights Movement? Well, there's another story that Rosa Parks has written about in her memoir. 4 days before she made her courageous decision, she attended a Till rally at Dexter Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, which youth minister Martin Luther King was officiating, and the keynote speaker was Dr. T.R.M. Howard that you saw in the film of Till. In that congregation, of course, is Rosa Parks. So 4 days later, she makes that courageous decision. That is the missing link that no one talks about when we say that Emmett was the catalyst that sparked the American Civil Rights Movement. Now, we've all been longing for a new movement today. You know, one of the things that Mother Mobley would often tell me when she was with us, she would say to me all the time, Keith, you must continuously tell Emmett's story until man's consciousness is risen. Only then that would mean justice for Emmett Till. For the longest time, I did not quite understand what she was saying to me. Being in my 20s, having this iconic woman, putting all this weight I felt on my shoulders because I did not want to fail her, by allowing me in her life and allowing me to explore these opportunities of producing film and so on. Only 20 years ago, I kind of realized what she was trying to tell me and what she was saying to me, because those words were prophetic in many ways, and I have to touch on this prophecy and Mother Mobley herself. But what she was saying was, no matter how hard we fight, how long we fight for justice for Emmett Till, it won't stop all the other Emmett Tills in this nation and abroad from happening. And as you can see in the past decade, that's what we're seeing every other day. And what she wanted us to realize or to understand, that the fight don't stop with Emmett. We have to continue the fight for all the other Emmett Tills that are happening, and it seems like on a daily basis today. We cannot disconnect what happened to Emmett Till in 1955 from Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others that are happening today. They are all one and the same. And she also wanted us to call these cases, or call the atrocities against these victims for what they are. And what do I mean by that? What we're seeing on the streets of America, whether it's at the hands of those who are sworn in to protect us or at the hands of white supremacists, is legalized lynchings. If you go back in 1955 and you look at this term and how Mother Mobley used this term when she lost her son, many civil rights organizations did not want to support her. Many politicians were afraid to be in the company of her because she used the word lynching about what happened to her son. Along the way now, as we progress and where we're at in this country today, many of us are too sensitive to even utter the word lynching. And so it found its way out of our vocabulary for some time. But again, we must understand what's happening before us, because if you see what's happening in the streets of America and you simply call them killings or murders, there's no sense of urgency there to fix it. But as soon as you hear the term lynching, it triggers you. And you have a better understanding the fight that we must continue and what must be done right now. And this is the things that I learned from this great woman that I had to grow into understanding because I was so young when I started. I started this at 22 years old. 22 years old of my life.
That's the age of a lot of people in this room.
Pretty much, right? But then you look at what Dr. King was doing back in those days, and those who were involved with the movement itself. I mean, we're a little backwards. You know, we're not doing as much as we should be doing. And one last thing, because I know you probably have more questions, and we may have some questions in the office. I mean, in the audience. I have to say this. Mother Mobley had the blueprint to man's liberation when it comes to racial progression in this country. And the harsh reality that we live in this country, racial progression has only happened through the blood, the sweat, and the death of the black body. Understand that. We have only had racial progression through that. And if we could arguably say that the civil rights movement was the most successful, the greatest, the most successful movement ever produced, and I have to put this out there, citizens of this country, black and white, then we must look at the story of Emmett Till and what transpired in 1955 and the courageousness of his mother, the late Mrs. Mamie Till-Mobley. Because only then will we truly understand how a movement started. Emmett was the poster child to the anti-lynching crusade. And as you saw in the back of the film, although Emmett's name, our new anti-lynching act is named after Emmett Till, it came off the struggle and the backs of others for over 120 years and close to 200 attempts.
Just embarrassing that it took until last year.
Very embarrassing.
Let's just see, because I know it's a school night, so some of you've got to get home, but do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to commend you for this masterpiece, this film, this story. I grew up on his story, basically. I'm from Harlem, actually.
Okay.
I just want to say it's just a coincidence that you started this journey back in '83, because I'm 29 right now. I was born in '83. And my mother was actually a teacher, so I grew up on the story of Emmett Till my whole life. Basically,
yes.
Just the culture, and I was always just really educated based on so many different things. And I'm in New York City my whole life, so I've had my fair share of just difficulties with law enforcement, unfair treatment. So this film is just a masterpiece, and I have to commend you for it. It's a great story, and to educate people who are unaware of the story, it's just a great thing to do.
Really appreciate it. Thank you, sir. You know, Harlem was a great home for, a home away from home for Mother Mobley. I know we touched on it at the end, the speech that was done in the park, but there were parades. A huge parade took place. And right after the trial in 1955, Mother Mobley was doing her tour, and when she was here, over 30,000 people we're out there, and it's a big parade going through Harlem. So Harlem, she had always embraced Harlem and the support she received from them.
Well, I also wanted to say thank you for your work. My question is in regards to some of the recent occurrences that have happened. I'm sure you're aware in the news, there was a young man, a 16-year-old that was shot.
That's right.
In Kansas City. Ironically, his shooter is an 84-year-old man. So
Yes.
when you brought up Carolyn's age, it kind of makes you put in perspective like the idea that accountability can also come at any age. So I definitely support that.
Thank you.
But also, as you being a Louisiana native, I want to know what your thoughts were on the 15-year-old Kawan Charles. I recently was at the National Action Network convention that happened this past week in Midtown. I would suggest anyone to attend.
Yes.
And I had the pleasure of meeting his cousin, Selena Charles, who she was advocating for her cousin's accuser to be held to justice because he was a 15-year-old child that in 2020 was essentially lynched in Louisiana, and he is, by his family, been called the modern-day Emmett Till. So I just want to know what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I've been in touch with the family, and I told them, look, whatever they need from me, I would definitely assist. You know, it's interesting that you should say this, and it's sad that we're continuing to see so much death and destruction in the country right now. But those of us who are students of history, who understand civil and human rights in this country, know whenever we come close to elections is when you see the ugliness of people come out the woodworks, and you see these type of cases happen. And so I think we're all vigilant now. I mean, social media, there are pros and cons to it. The pro is that we're able to see this destruction in real time and know that it's happening. The problem is, and the con is that it is not natural for human beings to see death in this capacity. So many of us are suffering from racial fatigue, and I understand that greatly. I mean, even with this film coming out, one of the biggest setbacks, I won't say biggest setback because we didn't have a big setback, but one of the disappointments that I had coming out with this film at this time was that a lot of us were suffering from racial fatigue, and many of us had not gone to the theaters to see this film because they were afraid. And I had never had to beg anyone to go see the work that I've done over the years at all. It just seems like every generation has a different tolerance.
But people were also angry at you on Twitter. Like, they were angry at you that this was the story that you chose to tell.
Yes, well, they were angry at me because of who was with me telling the story.
But they were also, I don't know, I remember reading some of the tweets, sorry to interrupt you, there were some of the tweets that, well, they were just saying, why would you tell such an unpleasant story, right? Why not tell a story that has a happy ending?
Well, with me, you know, I am doing everything what Mother Mobley wanted. I mean, it was our hope, and this is not just a film to me. You know, this is not a movie, it's a movement. Many of you who know me, you know that's my thing. This is not a movie, it's a movement. And it was a movement to reconcile the past of our past atrocities, but also what Mother Mobley wanted was to get this story back into the America's consciousness and to the world's consciousness to awaken that sleeping giant in us once again, that sleeping giant for change. Again, through all that we've been through in the past decade, with all the deaths that we have seen, We have all been longing for a new movement to happen. It hasn't happened yet. You have to question yourself and ask why. For 67 years, no one wanted this film told. Hollywood would not touch it. The state of Mississippi shunned everyone who would utter the words. Emmett Till, even the witnesses that I interviewed along the way was not supposed to talk to me or utter the word Emmett Till or something would happen to them. That's how dangerous talking about this specific story, because it deals with the sex and the race issue that we have a problem even today talking about in a public forum. But it also, again, has the blueprint to what we must be doing today. And that's what's been lost in translation and, of course, in the books of history, because the story of Till was never supposed to be told. And now that we have told it, and now that people are seeing it, I'm hoping they're getting a clear understanding. If we foresee a new movement, you have to understand Till and what transpired in 1955. I always say this too. There's no other story that speaks more to this generation, this political and racial climate, than the story of Emmett Till. This is a complete mirror image to what we're dealing with today. The social ills of our past are the same. We're fighting the same exact fight. The problem is that many of us are not educated about this history enough to see it happening before us or to see history repeating itself. All the rhetoric from the far right, and I'm not trying to get political here, it's the language of the Citizens Council of 1955 and how they wanted to make sure racial integration and racial progression never happens in this country. And those same entities, that same power still exists today. And now we're living in this anti-wokeness movement, where the term wokeness seems to be controversial or bad. And this is what we're seeing. History is repeating itself. Now, to fight this, we have to understand the past to move forward.